And we're back with another episode of What the Shell podcast. I got to put it up. What the Shell. There we go. We're excited today, especially after we took a week off last week.
Sorry about that.
I know we both needed some rest and recuperation, but we have an exciting guest today. We have the Turtle Man himself, Mr. Jordan Gray from the Turtle Survival Alliance. We're pretty excited to have him on, especially since he's been pretty busy with his schedule, doing webinars and things of that nature. Pretty hard guy to book. So, yeah, let me go ahead and add him to the stream. Jordan, welcome.
All right, there I am. Yeah.
You are here.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to chat with you guys about turtles. I gave up a plane ticket to go do some research on Hemidura subglobosa in Borneo, but not Borneo, Papua New Guinea. But I never know where my plane tickets are taking me. I just jump on them. But I said, you know what? If Cody Shepard needs me, then those Hemidura will have to wait.
Hey, I don't take that with a grain of salt because I think you're probably the person that I've inboxed the most with questions randomly, whether it's Terrapins, box turtles, anything. I'm like, who's going to know it? The Turtle Man is going to know it. That's who I need.
Oh, man, that's a lot of pressure.
No, don't be. I feel like a lot of people see you in the Facebook groups, but really don't know who you are. I know this might sound ignorant. When I was getting into publicizing that I keep turtles, because for a lot of people, they're like turtles, like the little green things you see in the pond. They look at you funny, but, when I was going through the groups, you were always a wealth of knowledge, but I didn't know what the TSA was. If I'm being completely honest, I didn't know who Jordan Gray was, but I saw you answering things scientifically, and I'm like, I need to get more information from this guy, Yeah.
Yeah, I try to give the best information I can, and from a lifetime of keeping turtles, researching turtles, and now in my later years, performing turtle conservation efforts. I've made a lot of mistakes along the way, and our mistakes are what, builds our knowledge base, as well as, of course, reading literature, talking to more people. So, I try to look at, when I answer things in groups, on both sides, because you have to realize that a lot of people who ask questions are novices themselves.
Right.
Everybody who loves turtles, who keeps turtles, who works on behalf of their conservation, we're all novices at one point. You guys and off Cody goes to go eat some cupcakes. But yeah, if I look back to 2004, when I started our Terrapin conservation group in Georgia, the Terrapin Educational Research Program of Savannah, and then look to where I in the program are now. That's a lot of years of learning. It's years of mistakes. It's adapting. It's evolving. So.
I was going to wonder, big question was, I think I had the question, I started out with Stephen too, you don't get to where you are just like most people think, how did it all start as far as you touched upon it as far as you learn by trial and error and just by, the years, I guess you could say, but when you first started out, how did you just dive in and start, volunteering and doing this and as much as you can? Because you're way more involved than a lot of people as far as, the conservation route. So it'd be just interesting to see how you gained so much. Do you have a degree, background? How did you originate in the whole entire?
Yeah, I'll kind of give a story from my youth, because people ask me all the time, why turtles? Why do I dedicate my life to turtles and their conservation and knowledge?
Yeah.
And really, it's for any of us who are passionate about something, and whether that be you're passionate about race cars, you want to be a NASCAR driver, whether you're passionate about being a neurosurgeon. There's just something innate that draws us all to something.
Yeah.
And luckily for me, it was wildlife, and turtles, and of course the habitats they live in. And I was really fortunate enough to grow up during my formative years in both upstate New York at West Point, where I basically had this whole entire military reservation, the United States Military Academy grounds, in which I could basically trounce around the woods safely, looking for reptiles and amphibians. And then later, when I moved to Virginia, again, I was surrounded by woods. So I always had an opportunity to get out and, look for the critters that inhabited the areas in which I lived. And so that, I was lucky enough, and I always have to say lucky enough, that I lived in places that could foster my knowledge and appreciation. So,
yeah.
I mean, I started keeping turtles at a very young age. My first turtle, surprise, surprise, was a red-eared slider. My father, I can still remember. I mean, we're talking about 5, 6 years old. I remember going to a pet store with my father, him being very apprehensive about getting this turtle, and then I got the turtle. And I kept it in very suboptimal conditions for the species. I mean, it was in upstate New York. I had it in a pen that was far taller than it was wide. Most of the pen was land, and then I had a sunken saucer that was only about 2 inches deep for its water area. And if I see somebody do that now, I can give them advice on what to do better. I mean, but the thing is realizing that we were all at that point at one stage, and that's what's so important for educating others, and especially we talk about social media where people are behind keyboards and can say anything they want to. Is sometimes holding back. Taking a step back, think about where they might be, and giving the best education you can. Now, sure, if said person becomes very stubborn and doesn't want to take any of the advice, and I've seen this many times where I might chime in, or any others chime in, and a person still won't take the advice. You just
like the hands.
God help God help that turtle, and hopefully the person comes to their senses when it comes to giving that animal the best proper care.
Yeah. Yeah. So did you actually pursue an education and stuff like that to actually get to where you're at, or did you just kind of really dig down deep in your own research?
All right, so this blows most people's minds. So, I mean, I started volunteering for a nature center when I was, I believe, 4th or 5th grade, and then so volunteered there for a while. Took place in summer camps, all that kind of stuff. During my high school years, I was always, again, after school, out in the woods and whatnot. And then after high school, so during high school, I was an athlete in many different sports. And by the time I was a sophomore in high school, I had completely set my sights on, attempting to take ice hockey as far as I could go with it. So I didn't go to college right away. I continued to play hockey after high school in what's called junior leagues. And then And then, there was a turn and all that. I ended up moving, and I got really interested in theater and film. So I changed courses once again, and started and became, enrolled in college and became a theater major, in which I was, in plays all the time, cast in small films. Sorry, hey dogs, just a second. Let me let them out back. I'll be back. Toby, Ziggy, what are you doing?
Talking about turtles and you got the dogs running around. Oh man.
I think I finally figured out how to do a watch party, man.
Long enough.
You know what it is they always, as soon as they run outside, they run straight to the turtle enclosures to go just stare at them, which is funny though, in that they're absolutely intrigued by the turtles, but they're scared to death of them.
Now, where are you at now? Located?
South Carolina.
Okay.
But
so when you do the roadways and stuff, you actually travel a couple hours then, or?
Oop, you're muted. There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry, I'm just getting some feedback. But yeah, so I travel down and I do the road work on the US Highway 80 causeway between Savannah and Tybee Islands, Georgia. Oh yeah, but what was I talking about? Yeah, so I did theater, so I did stage and I did film, and then another a serendipitous turn took place in which, while I was in Savannah, where I had enrolled in school and was doing theater, I noticed that on that particular causeway there was female terrapins that were getting hit in summertime. So that led me to begin this project, T.E.R.P.S, which is now 16 years old. And by getting involved in that project, I once again made a change. I went over to the biology side and then completed my degree in biology. Now, all told, I mean, I ended up having what I call my Van Wilder undergraduate college career. It took quite a bit longer than your 4 years. I went to 3 different schools. So moved a couple times, and after I was done with school, the following year, I then became an instructor of biology labs at that university. So I think by that point they were like, he's been here so long, let's just give him a key and let him teach the youth of America.
That's awesome, man.
Man,
that's crazy. That's
definitely not the path I would have thought you took. I can't lie.
Very atypical.
What's crazy that where your passion started is where your biggest, how you talk about the roadways. Like I never even imagined that's how you would have even got started, seeing just the dead animals, the terrapins on the road, and I mean, if that doesn't light a passion, seeing that kind of mortality and stuff like that. I mean,
right.
Because I'm from Ohio, and I never got to see them, native and stuff like that until I'm down here. But so it's pretty crazy, to even think that many turtles. It's almost like you see the crab walks and all that kind of native, natural kind of state occurring.
Right.
So,
how many do you guys typically find deceased? I mean, I know people probably don't want to hear this number, but I feel like it's something people should know on a year-to-year basis on that roadway.
So on that particular segment, anywhere from 100 to 200 die on the causeway. So you have you have a large annual death toll. Interestingly enough, there's also a significant amount of recruitment of new individuals into the population, which is still, it's really amazing considering the fact that you're getting a large number of adult females removed from the population on an annual basis. You have large populations of raccoons and feral cats in the area who are predators of the nests and hatchlings. Yeah. And then also the juveniles get hit on the roadway regularly too. So how there's any terrapins still left there is amazing, but it's also when you think about the Diamondback terrapin, you're talking about a testament to biological fortitude. I mean,
now, can you just? And I know you're going to go off on this tangent. I want you to. Most people that are watching, not watching, they know turtles, terrapins. The first thing we put out there, other than if you're in the group, they're like, we never even knew a turtle like that existed. Expand upon just terrapin.
All right, so yeah, let's talk about the word terrapin to start out. So terrapin is a Virginian Algonquin Native American term that means edible turtle, and so nowadays, scientifically speaking, we refer or generalize turtles who spend most of, if not all of their time in brackish water environments. So the confluence of marine water and fresh water, that's your brackish water environment. So here in the United States, the term terrapin is relegated to the 7 subspecies of Diamondback terrapin, which inhabit various forms of brackish water habitats. However, if you go to other places in the world, terrapin is also a commonly used term, which is maybe interchangeable with turtle. But there's this group of turtles in Southeast Asia of the genus Batagur, which are your large riverine and estuarine turtles. And there's only 6 species in that genre, and 3 of them are called roofed turtles, and 3 of them are called terrapins. And that seems pretty weird, but when you look at it, the 3 that are called terrapins, the painted terrapin, the northern river terrapin, and the southern river terrapin, all spend much of their life history coming in and out of brackish water environments or tidally influenced environments. And so that's why those 3 are referred to as terrapin. But when most people, here in, the New World, think about terrapin, they are thinking about the Diamondback terrapin.
No, I mean, I've always wondered that, especially with the painted river terrapins. I mean, I told Ed it was one of the turtles that I wanted to get. I'm curious, not to leave Diamondback terrapins, but what is the amount of time in comparison to Diamondback terrapins that they spend in brackish water? Because you mentioned that, they spend some time, but I mean, I'm sure you have an answer for that. I don't want to.
Yeah, so painted terrapins are an estuarine turtle. So they live at the in these brackish estuaries, and then will go up tidal rivers to where the brackish water, through a gradient becomes more fresh. They are able to go out into full strength saline ocean waters. As far as keeping them in captivity, however, they can be kept in fresh water. The key for painted terrapins, which there are breeders in Florida who in South Florida who breed and sell that species, is to make sure they are kept in warm water and that water body is sizable. So you're talking about like a backyard swimming pool for this turtle. They're quite a large turtle, roughly the size of your peninsula cooters. Females can grow even larger than that. So, large habitat, warm water year round, and some nice vegetation to feed upon.
I'm curious. I know when I first got my first terrapin, I was doing research, brackish, fresh, scientifically, how are they able to survive in salt water? And I was led towards research that says they have the ability in their glands to secrete salt. Do painted river terrapins also have that ability?
Typically for euryhaline species that can basically go in and out of fresh water, they do have some ability through lacrimal salt glands to be able to regulate the salt. None of these species have salt glands that are as evolved as marine turtles. And so then that's also brings us back to these taxa of turtles still needing fresh water for their physiology. So Diamondback Terrapins, they live in brackish water environments, but they still need fresh water for homeostasis.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I had a question going back to the roadways, actually, and this might be off topic, but
yeah,
you're talking about with the new, you've seen a lot of new mamas coming out, and genie pool. Do you notice any trend as far as specific patterns, coloration? Is it pretty consistent, or you see a wide range of different kind of, everyone likes to see that kind of stuff when the Diamondbacks because they're so versatile.
Sure.
You see any kind of differences as the years pass since you've been doing this so long, that's like, oh man, like they've kind of changed here, or just
so yeah, I mean, we've been taking GPS data on those females and juveniles hit on the causeway, looking for hot spots. And from what our data shows is that the Terrapins do utilize almost the entire length of the causeway. There is a slight deviation towards a couple hotspot areas. However, if you were to just, and that's based on doing analysis, but if you were to, with the eye, take a look at our data, it basically just shows a causeway covered in waypoints. The interesting thing about this area is, so when I started that program, and this is again only 15 years ago, I would commonly find well-matured female terrapins on this causeway. However, there's been a huge generational shift in that I'm going to use the term all, but even though that's not scientifically based, but I can just tell you from looking at these turtles that we'll say almost all of the females are newly matured females. They're all in the age range of about 5 to 7 years old. So every time we get a waypoint on a turtle carcass, we take a photo of the turtle carcass as is on the highway and then remove it so that you can't double count it. But the thing is that every time I'm picking up these carcasses and taking photos, is you can see very distinct growth annuli indicative of younger turtles. A well-matured female slowly loses the distinction of those growth annuli after annual shedding occurrences. So we've definitely seen a shift to a younger population, and I would say that the generation time is only about 7 years. You're basically just seeing this population constantly cycle out. Now, to do that, you still need to have eggs survive deposition, incubation, and for those youngsters to live to adulthood. That's happening somehow because year after year we are still seeing this mortality rate of 100 to 200 turtles.
I'm curious. So is that suggesting that the older females aren't using that causeway to breed, or they're not getting hit by vehicles?
So it's predominantly that older females are not utilizing that area. Any older females that were in that area are most likely now dead, or have possibly adopted other nesting areas. So, for instance, off of the causeway, there are some feeder roads, and on those, right alongside those feeder roads, I find well-matured females. And we're only talking about a difference of 50 meters between well-matured females nesting and young mature females coming up along the causeway. So it can be, a very, very small distance by crow's flight from where you find mature versus relatively immature females when looking at the issue of road mortality.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that now, is that something that's just almost instinctive? Like if they were utilizing an area and say like, okay, I'm using an example this past weekend. I went up to more of the Space Coast where more of the, the populations are more prevalent. Went on, the riverside, and a guy was with the metal detector was, scooching around, and I got talking to him, and he's like, yeah, I used to see terrapins all the time, up here, and underneath the seaweed, all the hatchlings and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, where? And he told me a park, and he was like, yeah, but they're long gone now because it all got developed and all the rocks and everything. So it kind of intrigued me because the same thing you were talking about is like, is that just even if it's like that big of a major difference in their natural thing they're used to go to, can they almost instinctively know that a better suitable area just by kind of veering off whichever side they used to go?
Yeah, I mean, so I can tell you right now that we've seen this when you build artificial nesting areas or more optimal nesting areas for turtles. Oftentimes the females will instinctively go there, and one of the things you ask yourself is, how do they even know to go there? Yeah. And again, this is an animal that is their environment. They are tuned into many more things, whether it's the hydrology, whether it's changes in humidity, pressure, all, smell, yeah, all of that we are not tuned into, so that they can search out and find new nesting sites. It's kind of, it's kind of like the, if you build it, he will come. Most people, because if you build it, he will come only applies to certain circumstances. Most people adopt that for if you build it, they will come. But that's the truth. If you build it, they will come. We've seen this time and time again where when new nesting habitat is created, turtles will oftentimes deviate their traditional patterns to use more optimal habitat.
Now, how often? What's as far as the juvenile, more early stages of mothers to mature? Is there a difference as far as how far inland they will go, or like is there like if they're young, do they just kind of venture off and they eventually find it, or the more mature know? They don't have to go as far. Is that like a natural inclination also as far as distance inland?
So that's also all right. Like for instance, let's talk about this causeway since we've already talked about it. On either side of the causeway are very, very narrow shoulders. If you've seen any of the videos, you'll see you're talking about only like a meter of suboptimal nesting habitat, whereas in only a couple miles away, you have all of these large hammocks and islands that the turtles could go travel to nest, but they don't. Now, that's talking about that population right along the causeway. If you move to, let's say, the population of terrapins that inhabits around Kiowa Island, South Carolina, the longest running Diamondback terrapin research program of the species, they find that the terrapins move out of their tidal creeks and go to this one particular location that's very, very sandy to go nest, and then they head back to their natal creeks. So a lot of it depends on the population, and also the thing that to remember with turtles, and it does impact also their conservation, is that turtles do have their own personalities. For instance, it's suggested that very outgoing box turtles very well have a better chance at relocation or translocation than do much more timid box turtles. That was suggested in 2019. So,
is that along the lines of people saying don't remove box turtles because they stay within, a certain mile radius as their home? Is that along that suggestion?
Right. So, we know that box turtles do have home ranges. Now, that home range is not static. It is an evolving polygon throughout the turtle's lifespan. So, if it were to be like this, you'll see it shift, in shape and stuff throughout the turtle's lifespan. Now, the fact of the matter is we've seen box turtles translocate perfectly well to new areas. There's also a lot of studies that have shown box turtles who do not translocate well and will travel well out of their habitat of translocation. So yes, the best practice is to always move a box turtle or any turtle across the road, for instance, in the direction it was heading, or if you find it in your backyard, just move it to the closest patch of woodland within proximity to your yard. Because these animals do have an incredible homing instinct. But that being said, there are successful attempts to translocate some species of turtle.
I'm curious, what is the proportion, or if it's even occurring, of males being hit on that causeway, or is it just the females primarily?
In 15 years, I've found one male hit on the causeway.
Wow.
So it is all females and juveniles.
Can you explain that?
Are those juvenile females or both?
They're too young to tell. They're all about, now they're about 3 years old, and in captivity you can typically tell the sex of a 3-year-old. However, with the growth rate in the wild, they're not yet showing secondary sex characteristics.
So I'm curious, now that you mentioned that, what is like the age comparison to most keepers of a 5 to 7 year old terrapin in the wild to what we might see in captivity size wise?
Down here in the South, a 5 to 7 year old terrapin is mature, but still hasn't reached their maximal carapace size. You see maximal carapace size attained, anywhere from 8 to 10 years of age, and then and then after that, you see the shell slowly wear down as a result of environmental forces, as well as we talked about, shedding of the scutes on an annual or biannual basis. But here's what's really interesting. Okay, there's a lot of terrapin keepers out there. I've kept and raised terrapins for years and years and years. I have yet to see a captive raised terrapin have the same shell morphology as a wild terrapin of the same size. And I'm speaking of juveniles, because what happens is, so the juveniles live very much a semi-aquatic existence. In captivity, we give them a primarily aquatic existence, but that's not the natural history of juveniles. And so most juveniles that I find, their shells are actually very much the morphology of bog turtles. And then once they begin to mature,
what that is. I'm sorry.
No, go look it up and go Google it. So it's honestly, Cody, it's really hard to describe. But
referring to shape or like?
Yeah, it's very much the shape, the height of the shell, the overall rigidness of the shell. I mean, let me tell you, if I were to go out and find a juvenile terrapin and show you today, you would say that doesn't look like terrapins that we raise in captivity. So what happens in the wild with terrapins is the morphology of the shell actually goes through an ontogenic shift once they start inhabiting more aquatic environments, and they become basically more streamlined for that aquatic existence, whereas in their earlier life, living that semi-aquatic lifestyle, their shell is rather different than you might be used to. In captivity, that they really almost don't even go through that ontogenic shift in morphology. They go through more of a direct route to adult morphology.
Now, does that have to do a lot of with diet and stuff like that? Because, when you shift to more of aquatic, you got more of the crustaceans and stuff like that. Like, are they really more finicky, picky, with the mainstream, like more land, the periwinkles and, more of the stuff like that? Does that have
I mean, when they're juveniles, they're hunters. They're also opportunistic scavengers. They're looking for those snails. They're looking for very small clams. Their diet is, it's heavily comprised of arthropods. So that can also include different types of worms, different types of insect larvae that is there along the edge of the marsh, and fiddler crabs and other things. And then you also have to take into account that, the growth rate of the animal is much slower in the wild. So the shell forms at a different rate of speed, and for the oftentimes at a different bone density. And then the other thing is that these animals in the wild, in their juvenile life stage, they are not an aggressive basking turtle. When you're a juvenile turtle, it is not, it is not in your benefit to be an aggressive basker until you've reached such a size where predation risk has decreased.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I'll go out on mud flats and find juvenile terrapins that are about 3 to 4 inches in size. But even then, they're still typically hidden to some degree by cordgrass, Spartina cordgrass. But you know, one thing that I want to bring up, and this is not just terrapins, is that I mean, even if you look at your map turtles, which are an aggressive basker. If you look at your cooters, your sliders, your painted turtles, all grouped as aggressive baskers, meaning they spend much of their time basking out of the water. You will see a lot of these turtles right after hatching along rivers, ponds. I know here in the South, for instance, in March, you can see hatchlings of all of these kinds of turtles, but then by April, boom, they're all gone. So there's a couple things to talk about there. Is one, they are soaking up those rays. They're basking aggressively, because who doesn't love a good lay in the sun and catch a tan. But that puts them at extreme predation risk, and especially to birds. So when April comes along here in the South, and all of those hatchling turtles who are technically aggressive baskers disappear, I believe it's one of two things. It's either all of those turtles that were basking aggressively have been picked off by predators, or that they learned to transition to a natural history that heavily excludes aggressive basking, because again, that puts them directly in harm's way. So,
yeah.
All that being said, juvenile diamondback terrapins spend most of their time hidden beneath grasses, dug into the mud, beneath marsh rack, etc. They're, many people raise them with bright spotlights on them and basking areas where they can come haul themselves out and completely dry off. And the truth of the matter is that's really not in their life history.
So, question: since that's where most time where they spend is more inland, as far as the whole, still needing some fresh water, how does that dictate as far as when they're younger, trying to, go to, any kind of little, freshwater kind of inlets or whatever they need, to get that? Do they actually still travel, or they just mainly stay in that marine ecosystem?
Okay, so as adults, their main source of fresh water is during rainfall, and they will. So because of you all might know this, but for those watching, because salt water is more dense than fresh water, when it rains, you will get about 1 millimeter of freshwater layer on top of the salt water, and the terrapins will go up and drink from that 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters layer of fresh water, or they will actually stick their heads out of the water, open their mouths, and let rain fall into their mouths. Another option they have to get fresh water is, especially during times of drought, is traveling to areas where there is fresh water running off into their ecosystem, where they can drink some of that fresh water. As far as the hatchlings and juveniles are concerned, because they live in those peripheral edges of the marsh or the mangroves, they're right at that confluence where fresh water running off the land from heavy rainfall is within close proximity to where they're already inhabiting, being able to give them that almost more rapid opportunity to obtain fresh water.
Yeah, that's interesting.
No, I'm definitely.
When you get to appreciate, how much terrapins actually go through in their life cycle. I mean, you cannot not just almost admire that kind of survival.
Yeah,
I'm curious about. I see you guys and different projects up the Atlantic coast do some head starting and projects of that nature. When you're head starting them, do you head start them a certain way to kind of match the wild so their shell forms the same way, or does it just happen that you can't mimic that? I don't know if I'm making sense.
Like, so,
yeah, that makes
like,
sense.
say with the whole hurricane thing, and you had 60, 70, Terrapins, and they had them all together. Did they just keep them all together and as well as they could, and the biggest thing they could?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, those Terrapins were all raised together in a large tub. With Terps, we head start Terrapins every year and release them. Over time, especially in the last several years, we've been able to get to a feeding and regime and water temperature that very most naturally replicates the shell morphology of the wild juveniles, and that's a testament to all the students who work with that program at the university. Now, as far as aquatic setups, we raise the turtles in a completely aquatic setup. We do not give them basking sites. We stock their habitats heavily with artificial plants, and the turtles can then use those artificial plants to haul up and bask, where the humidity is still heavily retained, as opposed to having a hard basking site in which humidity is rapidly lost. And that also brings us up to the issue of pyramiding. So pyramiding is common in captive turtles. It's very much tied to humidity and the ability for the bones to grow properly and for proper keratin development. So proper keratin development of the outer layer of the shell relies heavily upon humidity for its almost basically its relaxation. So when a turtle, you have to imagine, here's a turtle shell, right? Just think of it like the world, okay? And the world is, we have all these tectonic plates. And what happens when tectonic plates push up against one another is you get mountain ridges, etc. Now for us on this world, that happens over the course of millions of years. But when you're growing a turtle, think of a turtle as a globe full of tectonic plates. All of these separate pieces of bony shell that are all basically fused together. But think of the amount of pressure that is being exerted on that bony shell as it grows. And that's where moisture is so important, to be able to relax that pressure. So what happens when you add, like, say you put a hatchling terrapin on a basking site that's 110 degrees. All right, what happens when you take a piece of plywood, get it wet, and put it out in the sun? Okay, you're not going to come back to a flat piece of plywood anymore. That plywood is going to warp. And so I use that as an analogy for the way that turtle shells grow. When they're going through this regular cycle at such a young age, where you have dermal bone, which is slowly calcifying into calcified bone. You have these new layers of keratin that are forming from underneath. If you're going through this constant wet and dry, especially dry heat cycle, think of it just think about the effect that is having on the growth of those platelets.
Yeah.
So I know I went off on a long tangent there, but so using that, we raise our terrapins in just at a fully aquatic environment, water temperature in the low to mid 80s. They get ultraviolet as well as full spectrum light. Yeah. But then there is also a basking lamp, but again, that basking lamp is of a lower wattage. We only use 75 watts for our basking. And then it's pointed towards the plastic plants. So again, those turtles have an opportunity to thermoregulate while still maintaining proper humidity.
That's interesting. So like when you're talking about rehoming and even hatchlings, but what about, when you're on the roadways and you have to rehab and you've seen ones that have been able to make it, you rehab them and how they, as far as transition wise, from such a wild to a captive setting and feeding, rehabbing, how have you seen the reintroduction or not, if they're not even able to, how have you seen that transition as far as their behavior and, adaptability?
Mm-hmm. Let me answer that question as soon as I let the dogs in, because they're being
you're good.
They're being jerks.
Yeah, man, I've been getting pulled in 100 directions trying to help my daughter out.
Yeah, you're good. We got a couple questions too.
All right, so what were we talking about? Who knows?
About the head starting and the wild caught,
Right. So for instance, all right, a turtle is able, like Diamondback Terrapins, are able to undergo an adaptation to brackish water environments within 24 hours of their introduction to them. So if you take a terrapin who's lived in fresh water and then move it to brackish water, their bodies can rapidly adapt. Now, is that recommended? Not, that is a little bit tough on their organs, and especially if you were to take, like for instance, if you were to take a turtle, a terrapin in freshwater, and move it to a high saline environment, such as that at almost ocean strength, that is a shock to their body. It's a shock to their physiological processes, and it's a transition that normally wouldn't happen in the wild. So when you are introducing head-started or rehabilitated terrapins, it's best to have either kept them in the same levels of brackish water in which they came from, or to transition them back to brackish water prior to their release.
How about the food and appetite? Did you just, kind of mimic what they naturally would, or did they take to it fairly quickly? I mean,
yeah. So for wild injured terrapins, you typically want to keep them on their wild diet of fiddler crabs and snails. And oftentimes, over a long period of time, they very well can adapt to a different diet. However, that's not the goal for rehabilitation. The goal is to get the animal back out in the wild. And so continuing to feed it its wild food types is the best practice. Now, as far as head-starting terrapins, we and most head-starting operations, or rear and release, we can call it as well, typically will use some sort of formulated diet, whether it be Missouri or Zoomed or Hikari or Tetra as a base diet. But what we do is, as we transition them before release, we'll start giving them more of those wild food types. I can tell you from firsthand experience, when we release these head-started terrapins into the wild, they begin hunting immediately. Like, you wouldn't know how many releases I've done where you will see the turtles immediately just start nailing crabs and snails and stuff like that. And these animals have were hatched in captivity, grown up in captivity for 10, 12 months, and boom, their wild instincts are like that. It's millions of years of evolution ingrained in them.
No, that's awesome. I feel like we're almost at the end of our time for our podcast today, but
yeah, no worries.
I know we definitely like to have you back on, especially so you can talk about your webinars and the work that TSA is doing and how we can get involved. Because I feel like as captive breeders, or I wouldn't necessarily call myself a breeder yet or anything of that nature, but as captive keepers, we all want to find a way to kind of help, but it's like, how do we help something that, we're not scientists, Ed and I aren't wildlife biologists, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you have a degree in wildlife biology.
Well, it's a really, really good topic and one that has been discussed heavily. And honestly, I get messages from friends who are breeders regularly asking how they can help out with turtle conservation, because they love these animals.
Right.
And I've talked about this because oftentimes there is this separation between academics and environmentalists and conservationists and those who are in the hobby and breeding. And I always try to say, don't lump everybody together. Don't lump them into categories. I think of my friend like Chris Leone, who I know you all know from Garden State Tortoise in the Turtle Room, who he breeds a plethora of taxa of turtle and tortoise, but he is very, very conservation minded. And I know you all know about his and Casey's a project for Diamondback Terrapins. So it's important that we are able to integrate our knowledge together for the long-term preservation of these animals. So yeah, I'd love to come back on. There's so many more topics that we can talk about, and that is a very, very good one, is how the hobbyist, how the breeder can involve themselves in the conservation of the animals that they love.
Well, that basically, bounces upon, Ryan McVeigh, with the whole U.S. ARC and the actual keeping, and, how important it is to, it's great to keep and, to love the animals and stuff like that. But there has to come a point to where, whether it's not conservation or not, almost do your part in aiding and, helping, able to even keep the hobby alive, for conservation. And, because they both, they both benefit, from each other, and for the species overall for the long haul. So yeah,
right. And and I look at it as, for everybody who does breed and potentially profit off of the breeding of whether it's turtles or snakes or lizards, at some point those animals, their parents, their grandparents, whatever, they came from the wild. They were collected from the wild. They were shipped. They were sold. And so it's recognizing that, let's say, your livelihood from these animals did originate from nature. And so being able to look at that and say, how can I give back to that?
Yeah.
No, that definitely be, when this finishes, we'll have to pencil you in to get you back on, because I'd love to talk in depth about that. I know we're coming to the end, and I did want to share the pictures that you told me to go on your Instagram and find, and give you opportunity to talk about some of these special turtles, as you call them.
I'm sure you probably just downloaded the ones of me as a male model or something.
That's the one, dude. He sent me a couple pictures. I'm like, which one do you want to use? I'm like, whatever one. And I was like, the shirtless one? I don't know.
I thought he was Haynes a Haynes model for a second.
Oh no, the shirtless one. That's the best one. Bring that. Yeah, that brings.
I'm gonna go ahead and share the screen to the pictures.
Sure.
Yeah, especially for people that aren't very.
So there's a nesting female Mississippi Diamondback Terrapin, Malaclemys Terrapin pileata.
How?
Wait, you just froze.
Yeah, you cut out.
Am I still here?
Yeah, you're good.
Now you're back now.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I'm going through a huge rainstorm. My question is, in South Carolina, how often do you actually work with this subspecies?
I have a couple specimens of pileata for outreach, and those were donated to us. So I don't get to work with this subspecies very often, but I did live in Texas and worked with what we'll call their sister subspecies, Malaclemys terrapin littoralis, the Texas Diamondback terrapin. Very similar in appearance and morphology.
All right, let's go to the next picture. This one was pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, that turtle is one of our head starts. I nicknamed her Wilhelmina because of that W that you see on her face. So she was Wilhelmina, and I actually had put out a call for names, and whichever one got the most likes, that's the name she got. But it had to start with a W, and so that's Wilhelmina, and that is right before Wilhelmina was released.
That's awesome.
How long ago was that?
That was at the early fall 2018.
So you'd anticipate, 4 years or so, you might see Wilhelmina again?
I hope to never see her again. I hope that she lives a life in the wild, undisturbed. Yeah. Well, in the area where she was released, we don't do any sort of post-release surveys or mark recapture.
That's awesome.
Okay.
You just say good luck. So that is a captive bred male Mississippi Diamondback Terrapin. That is actually an offspring of that female that we saw a couple pictures before. And if you look at, he looks just like his mama with those big spots against that whitish gray skin.
Is this what would be previously considered a super Texan?
Oh boy, yeah, you want to get me started, right?
We might have to save that discussion.
Save the integrates for the next one.
Let's have a whole discussion on Diamondback Terrapin names in the hobby.
I think it needs to be
most Texans in the hobby are all actually pileata that are just labeled Texans because they're the lighter phenotype of pileata. But this specimen here, sure, I'll bet you could call that a super Texan.
Dude, how about
I'll bet my buddy Mike Roth would call that a super Texan. Love you, Mike.
We're do a part 2, man.
Yeah, we definitely. All right, this one. I had to get this one.
Wait for that one.
Yeah, that's a beauty. So that's just a high yellow ornate Diamondback Terrapin, Malaclemys Terrapin macrospilota, and who knows what I'm going to say. So this subspecies is native to the west coast of Florida, basically from the central panhandle down to remote southwest of Florida.
Do you have any inclination or educated guess as to why it literally I know we see flowerbacks in the hobby too, but like that prevalent of a yellow, any idea how or why? Just because of just a gene pool kind of mix up?
Yeah, it's just within the gene pool. I've seen others like it, and it is it's just an atypical specimen, and that phenotype may be more prevalent than we think. but as far as you know, at least from Tampa Bay to the Florida Panhandle, the Terrapins typically fit that holotype specimen for which they were named, the Macrospilota, which is in reference to the orangish yellow centers of the scutes on a basically blackish dark gray carapace.
No, that's awesome. I was curious how you came into possession of that. Was that another outreach animal?
Yeah, that one was specifically donated for outreach.
That's awesome, man. I feel like a lot of people hatch beautiful animals and, you know, don't realize the opportunity to have that animal, you know, serve as an educational tool, you know?
I feel like more than anything, the more you see some wild specimens, they are just, I mean, I you know, gorgeous, you know, for a lot of captive, you know, specifically, you know, bred, but dude, nothing will ever beat the natural simplicity of a wild caught, and it's so unique in and of itself, almost each one. Like, I don't care how normal it might look, it's not.
Nothing will ever beat a turtle in the wild. I mean, I you know, I own lots of turtles that I use for outreach, and I try to build as naturalistic enclosures for them as possible, and it still doesn't come close to seeing that animal in the wild. And that's where it's so important to get people out into the wild and do turtle spotting so that they really, really have an appreciation for these animals. And then also, yeah, like a specimen like that, I would say, you know, 90% or more of Terrapin hobbyists would look at that and think of its breeding potential. Whereas in another percentage that I'm lumped in with, and that's no offense at all. Okay, that's just natural inclination towards that, is looking at that turtle and being like, wow, think about how many people you can inspire with that turtle because of its beauty. And so when I see a specimen like that, that's what I, you know, personally what I think is, think about all those who will be inspired just by seeing her.
Yeah, no doubt.
No, that's awesome. I think that was the perfect animal to end our podcast today. We're definitely gonna have to get you back on because I mean my brain's already spinning.
There's talking about turtles is never ending. So
I mean
you can learn as much as you want to, and there's still way more to learn.
No, agreed. I appreciate it for having you on the show, man. I'm really thankful you agreed to. And I really hope that people really get an insight into who you are and the wealth of knowledge you have. Hopefully your inbox won't be spammed with men and women trying to get your information and, you know, looking for blind dates.
No, that's okay. Yeah, well, they'd have to fight off my girlfriend. So
there you go, and your dog.
Yeah, and the dogs. I'll forward any of those kind of messages to her, and she can deal with it.
And it's awesome knowing that too. You know, now that you know people hopefully have some kind of avenue that you know they can reach out to if they see you know an injured turtle or even on a roadway. I mean, just some kind of just little nuggets that they can pick up on and take with them.
Yeah.
You know, for when they, because it's almost like I'd say luck of the draw when you just stumble upon you know a nesting terrapin or just any animal. You know, so it's good to have that basic knowledge, man.
And you know what? I don't mind people contacting me. With my job at TSA, I routinely basically respond to calls regarding, I found this turtle in the road, this turtle's nesting in my backyard. And these calls come from all over the place. I mean, I respond to calls from Brazil, from Puerto Rico, from Canada, from Michigan, California, and you know, I do my best to help them out with whatever circumstance they're in. So no, I mean, I don't.
Or anything that people can, you know, that you prefer.
Yeah, I prefer them to go to turtlesurvival.org and then contact us through that info@turtlesurvival.org. So then that email can be filtered and relayed to me.
Yeah, if you send me the link, I'll post it in the comment, or what's it called, the description.
Cody, aren't you a school teacher? You can't put in turtlesurvival.org?
It is summer break. Summer break after coronavirus. Isn't that funny?
Oh, yeah. I just noticed that Travis Whitaker on the live comments has been typing in. He says Black Velvet MVP. I know what he's talking about. He knows that I love dark colored Terrapins with their nice mustaches. So
no, it was a great show. Guys, we are at the end of our podcast. We appreciate you guys for watching, and we will see you next week on What the Show.
What the?
All right. Hey, guys. Thanks a lot for having me on.
Appreciate you, brother.
No, we appreciate it. And